Hey everybody, my name is ArinTheWolf and welcome to a brand new one video retrospective. Throughout this channel's lifespan, I want to do a bunch of one-off retrospectives where I take a look at an entire series that either doesn't have that many games in its lineup, or the gameplay of the series stays pretty much the same every entry. Examples include F-Zero, Five Nights at Freddy's, Mega Man, Smash Brothers, and much more. The Sonic retrospective will still be happening, and you'll definitely see new videos for it every now and then. But once in a while, I want to take a breather from it to look at some other franchises that pique my interest. Right now, that interest has led me to the Streets of Rage series, also known as Bare Knuckle in Japan, releasing 3 games on the Sega Genesis as well as a 4th entry coming out rather recently. When it comes to the Genesis library of games, the first thing I think of is of course Sonic the Hedgehog, but right after that, Streets of Rage comes to mind. Now, I'll be honest when I say that I'm not the biggest fan when it comes to the beat-em-up genre of video games. Even for me, they can get a little too repetitive for my liking, leading me to quit the game before I even finish it. That said, there are still some great beat-em-ups I've played, like Scott Pilgrim, Turtles in Time, The Simpsons arcade game, and even Ninja Baseball Batman. Who the heck remembers that gem? But without a doubt, my favorite of them all is Streets of Rage. I don't know what it is, just something about how these games are made I really enjoy. So with the 4th game out, I thought, why not? Let's take a look at the entire series. And that's what we will be doing today. To play these games, I'll be using the Genesis Classics collection on Switch for 1 through 3, and we'll also be playing the PS4 version of 4. With that said, I'm ArinTheWolf, and this is a Streets of Rage retrospective. So before we talk about Streets of Rage, we have to first talk about another beat-em-up franchise, Final Fight. Final Fight was released in arcades in 1989 by Capcom. The genre had been dabbled in with games like Kung Fu, Double Dragon, and River City Ransom, but it was Capcom's take on the bare-knuckled brawler that truly brought the genre into a new light. Final Fight was the game that introduced colorful characters, detailed backgrounds, and excellent pick-up-and-play co-op, which was in River City Ransom and Double Dragon to be fair, but Final Fight was a refinement for the genre as a whole. With that said, it's pretty obvious that Streets of Rage borrows a lot from Final Fight, complete with food you could find in the trash cans to replenish your health. However, Streets of Rage still managed to be its own game thanks to the game's sense of style. Each of the original 3 characters were designed to be different from one another with their own unique martial art and character design. In other words, the characters weren't simply color swaps. You had Karate Master Axel Stone, Judo expert Blaze Fielding, and ex-professional boxer Adam Hunter. Each of the 3 characters had different stats, making the choice of character a lot more important than it usually was back then. With games like Double Dragon, Jimmy and Billy had the exact same stats, with the only difference being their looks. In Streets of Rage, however, each character was made to cater to a specific playstyle, which gave them a greater sense of identity. The series would go on to introduce even more characters to its roster, including wrestler Max Thunder, Adam's younger brother Skate, and cyborg Dr. Gilbert Zan. All of these characters feel unique in terms of design and gameplay, on top of the simple yet satisfying game mechanics designed by Noriyoshi Oba, who had also worked on Revenge of Shinobi. And finally, the delicious cherry on top of all of this was the fantastic soundtrack composed by Yuzo Koshiro. His mixture of techno and house created a badass soundtrack perfect for beating the crap out of everyone around you. In my opinion, outside of Sonic 2, the Streets of Rage games have the best soundtrack on the Sega Genesis bar none. Needless to say, the series was a success, which led to 2 sequels on the Genesis and eventually a 4th game on the 8th generation consoles. Now with all of that said, let's finally take a look at the series properly, starting with the first game. Alright, so Streets of Rage 1 on the Genesis. As the first game in the series goes, Streets 1 still holds up pretty well, especially for a game on the Genesis. There were other beat-em-ups prior to this, examples being Golden Axe and Alien Storm, but Streets of Rage was a one-of-a-kind game on the Genesis. Keep in mind, Final Fight only had console ports on the Super Nintendo, and since this was the console wars we're talking about, Streets was pretty much Sega's answer to the series. But enough backstory, how does one play Streets of Rage? Well, it's pretty self-explanatory, but let's take a look anyway. Streets of Rage is a beat-em-up game where you, well, beat people up. It's quite simple, really. The game uses 3 buttons: B for your attacks, C for jumping, and A is used for a limited screen nuke where a police car rolls in and fires a bazooka, wiping out everyone on screen. With how simple the game really is, it's not about what you do, but how you do it. Your enemies will come in a variety of different flavors, including generic street thugs, ladies with whips, torch-juggling clowns, and Wolverine wannabes. The game takes place over the course of 8 stages where you start the game in the Streets of Rage and end in the headquarters of the series villain, Mr. X, which is probably the most overused name in the history of villains. Graphically speaking, the first Streets game still holds up rather decently, though the sequels are definitely better graphically. And do I even need to mention that the soundtrack is excellent? Because it is. While it's not quite as fine-tuned as the second game's soundtrack is, it's still really dang good. I'm just gonna lay it out right now, the whole series has killer music, so don't expect me to go into it much besides that. With that said, the first game definitely isn't perfect. Now, to be fair, it is the first game in the series, so I will have to cut it some slack, but I did want to address some issues I have with this first entry. While the soundtrack is superb, the sound effects I feel could have been much better. The sounds for when an enemy falls and punching are just a little too crunchy sounding for my personal taste. I understand that Genesis games were known for their more heavy sounding music and sound effects, but the thing is, Streets of Rage 2 improved on the sound design so much that going back to the first game can be a bit of a challenge. Speaking of challenge, much like a lot of these old beat-em-ups, Streets 1 has limited continues which if you use up, you'll get a game over and have to start all over again. Now, to be fair, the difficulty in Streets of Rage 1 is challenging but fair. Most of the time when I lose a life, it's legitimately my fault since I wasn't being careful enough. But that can't be said for the bosses because these brutes can seriously take punishment and their attacks are hard to see coming. The 5th stage's boss in particular is extremely difficult because of how much they move everywhere, making it hard to even get a hit on. I ended up having to use this collection's rewind feature just to even beat them, and that's just ridiculous. With that said, for being the first game in the series, Streets of Rage is still decent by today's standards. While I don't view it as underrated like I do with Sonic 1, I have to thank this game for not only standing out amongst the crowd, but for paving the way for what beat-em-up games could become. And with that said, let's move on to the first sequel, Streets of Rage 2. So, Streets of Rage 2. Talk about a perfect sequel to a game. Streets 2 does everything that a good sequel should do. It improves upon the gameplay of Streets 1, the graphics are a major step up, the sound design is even better than before, the soundtrack is once again fantastic, and it's just simply a much better experience all around. Where to start though? Well, let's start with the graphics. I think it's pretty obvious how much of an improvement they are over the first game. Although they're bigger than before, the sprites all look so much more detailed this time around. The turkey and apples you find all look like you could actually bite them in their 16-bit pixels. Sound design wise, Streets 2 feels and sounds way more satisfying than before, all without sounding too crunchy and heavy. Just compare the two games for yourself. As far as the enemies are concerned, Streets 2 expands a lot more with its punching bags with the inclusion of rogue bikers, kung fu henchmen, fire-breathing blobs, and even, aliens? Am I playing Streets of Rage or Alien Storm right now? This game also introduces characters' special moves. At the cost of some health, each character can perform a special attack that is useful for taking care of enemies and hordes a lot quicker. While that is a nice addition and all, they unfortunately removed the screen nuke move from the first game, which frankly could have been very helpful sometimes, especially when there's 5 enemies on the screen at once. As far as the bosses are concerned, most of them, with some exceptions, have a good balance of hard but fair. As long as you know the correct time to strike and how to avoid the boss's attacks, you should be able to finish them off in no time. Though my biggest complaint with this game is that, once again, if you use up all your continues, you are forced to play the whole game all over again. Which is kinda crappy, but I guess it's just something that you gotta expect from these first 3 entries, as well as Genesis games in general, so I'll just leave it at that. So yeah, Streets of Rage 2. Pretty much better than the original in every way. It's way more detailed, plays better, sounds better, and just plain feels better to play. In short, Streets of Rage 2 is undoubtedly my favorite game in the original trilogy. Which leads us to... Streets of Rage 3 is the weakest game in the series. There, I said it. Apparently from what I've seen, everyone else thinks so too, and I really don't blame them. Streets of Rage 3 is not a perfect sequel like Streets 2 is. It's a perfect example of the phrase, one step forward, two steps back. Graphically speaking, Streets 3 looks somehow less detailed than the second game. It definitely looks better than Streets 1, but nowhere near as good as Streets 2. Also, while the previous two games had backgrounds that were very colorful and stylish, Streets 3's backgrounds have a significant oversaturation of brown and green, which frankly don't look all that pleasing to the eye. Don't even get me started on the dance club, because that place has a ton of flashing lights, which probably gave kids in the 90s seizures playing it. As far as enemy variety is concerned, Streets 3 just uses the exact same enemies from the previous games without many additions at all. I mean, besides the clown with a whip and the boxing kangaroo, almost every enemy is just from another game, which is incredibly disappointing. On top of that, the soundtrack is honestly pretty forgettable, which is absurd since Yuzo was still composing for the series at this point in time, so what's the deal? But to be positive for a second, there is one improvement that I really like. Unlike Streets 2, which allowed you to perform a special move at the cost of some health, this game allows you to perform a special move for free with the trade-off of having a 3-second cooldown each time you use it, which feels much better than before. But yeah, other than that, what else is there to this game? It's just not as good as the first two games in my opinion, and you can tell that from my capture lane. While my recordings for both Streets 1 and 2 go on for about an hour, I only spent 38 minutes on the third game, which really shows how much I cared to play it. And with this game out of the way, let's finish the video on a high note with the infinitely better sequel, Streets of Rage 4. Streets of Rage 4 was released a full 26 years after the previous game. Instead of being developed by Sega themselves, Streets 4 was developed by Dotemu, Lizard Cube, and Guard Crush Games. 4 takes place 10 years after the original trilogy, when Mr. X was defeated once and for all. However, a new threat has come in the form of Mr. X's own offspring, the Y-Twins. Also, kind of an unoriginal name, but hey, at least it's better than Mr. X. And so, Axel and Blaze must team up with Cherry Hunter, Adam Hunter's daughter, and Floyd, apprentice of Dr. Zan, to travel across 12 stages and defeat the Y-Twins once and for all. Now I know what you're all probably asking, is this game the best in the series? If you ask me, abso-freaking-lutely. Let's start with the graphics. The glow up between Streets of Rage 3 and 4 is astounding. We've gone from lackluster sprite art to beautiful hand-drawn character models and backgrounds. Every single piece of art in this game looks unique and fresh. It truly feels like a modernization of these characters and environments we come to love. The soundtrack, although bringing on 2 new composers for the series, Olivier Deriviere and Motohiro Kawashima, series veteran Yuzo Koshiro is still here doing a fantastic job, and with their combined efforts, Streets of Rage 4 has in my opinion the best soundtrack in the entire series. As far as the gameplay is concerned, Streets 4 is structurally the same as before, but with 2 significant improvements to the gameplay. For one thing, instead of a set number of lives and limited continues, this game now gives you 2 lives you can use per stage, and they always reset after every stage you complete. Plus, in case you're not a fan of that design choice, you could just select arcade mode for your classic Streets of Rage experience. And secondly, this game's special moves are without a doubt the best they've ever been. Streets 4 brings back Streets 2's special moves that cost health to use, however, unlike in that game, you can replenish your health after you use them by attacking enemies, with the added risk of if you get hit yourself, you'll lose that health forever, so be careful. This game also introduces new EX moves you can use that act as both screen nukes and also a great way to remove a big chunk of boss's health. This gives the whole game a good risk versus reward system that rewards players for playing riskier for better results. And to top it all off, the bosses are the best the series has ever had. They are the perfect balance of challenging to keep you on your toes, while not being so hard as to become frustrating. And maybe it's just because of the smoother animations, but it's now a lot easier to know when the bosses are about to strike. thus allowing you to dodge in time. Honestly, at this point, I feel like such a broken record, but that truly shows how consistently awesome this series is. You can even unlock the original 16-bit characters from Streets 1 through 3, complete with crunchy sound effects. If you ask me, Streets of Rage 4 is the best beat-em-up game I've ever played, and I highly recommend you all pick it up. It's available on Steam, PS4, Xbox One, and Nintendo Switch, so go play it when you can. There's even an online mode, and honestly, it's great too. Even with my subpar internet, I was able to comfortably play with people online, and I can really admire that. Unless there's something seriously wrong with your internet, you should be able to play it smoothly online no matter what. I mean, what more can I say? I've been writing this script for a good 4 hours now, and I think I've gotten my point across. Streets of Rage is an awesome franchise, and I really would like you guys to play it someday. The fourth game should definitely be your first choice if you decide to do so, but the second game is also pretty great as well. And with all that said, I'm ArinTheWolf, and I hope this long video was worth something to you all. Stay strong, and live life.